Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Lowdown. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Daniel Geey, partner at Sheridan's Law and author of Done Deal and his latest book, Build the Invisible. Daniel, a big warm welcome to the show.
Thanks, Connor. Seemed only a couple of weeks ago we were in, I'd like to say sunny Miami, but it wasn't sunny. It was absolutely torrential rain Miami, but I still had a good time.
Yeah, and like to my own detriment, I'm going through podcast files there from a few weeks back, trying to edit out actually the hurricane in the background. That's it. Review them. But I mean, that's actually a perfect place to begin. I mean, how in fact did you find your American trip? I believe you were in Miami, but you were also in New York.
It was great. I actually hadn't done a bit of a long haul trip for a while. In fact, probably pre-COVID, in truth, just for lots of different reasons. So it was great to get out there. I do quite a lot of talking and lecturing work with Dr. Erkut Sogut, who is Mesut Ozil's agent, who's a great guy, loves teaching as well and sharing knowledge. So we had a great week. We were into Miami on the Monday doing a day's business course, Soccer X speaking Tuesday, Wednesday. I was speaking in Miami Uni during that time, in New York University, and then meeting some clients I hadn't seen for a while. So I tried to sort of get as much in as possible for the week. As it turns out, I forgot my laptop charger in Miami, so had a panicked Thursday in New York trying to find the right charger and adapt. Anyway, the usual nonsense that happens only when you're traveling, and then you actually need the laptop to do some work. But apart from that, it was it was really productive. Thanks.
Tell me about it. I know all that hassle that goes into going between UK and US charges, but in fact, I mean, Daniel, something you brought up there, Miami University, and you do an awful lot of student seminars. Indeed, that is how we first became acquainted years ago now. I believe at Birkbeck back in 2019. It's the first time you've done such in the US, if I'm not mistaken. Would you find were there massive similarities or striking differences in terms of the topic of discussion brought up by students in the US?
Connor, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, I lost you for some reason. Apologies.
No, I'll just repeat there. No problem at all. I mean, Dan, you do an awful lot of student seminars. Indeed, that's how we became acquainted years ago at Birkbeck. It's the first time that you've done as such in US, if I'm not mistaken. Were there massive similarities or striking differences in terms of the topics of discussion that were brought up by US students?
Well, the thing is actually in more general terms is with writing the second book, the idea actually was just to try and say a few other things rather than talk about football is in truth be slightly less of a one-trick pony. And then the idea really was to a degree to talk about wider career stuff, self-development ideas, you know, constantly trying to, better yourself, improve, reflect on things that have gone well or otherwise. And the talk that I was trying to give along with Erkut in Miami was actually around, some of the core sports business areas, mainly football is the truth, because that's where a lot of my experience lies. And then talk about some of my career journey and some impart a tiny bit of wisdom of things that I've learned over the years, which then I think have quite universal appeal, regardless of, if you're in the US or UK or South America or, Australia, for example. I think there's lots of core areas because I think going back to, first principles, when I started writing the second career book, my idea actually was to try and write the book that I'd always given bad answers to for people beforehand, which is, how do you become a football agent, or how do you make it in the football business, or do the thing that you want to do? And instead of giving a paragraph answer, I tried to write 15,000 words on it. And that was the sort of birth of Build the Invisible, the truth.
Yeah, and I would say Build the Invisible is a tremendous second iteration and it builds nicely upon Done Deal. But for those that aren't caught up with your journey today, Daniel, could you please take them through when you're speaking of how the generalist pathway, but could you please take me through rather how a former aviation and car parts lawyer ends up working in a beautiful game?
Well, yes, it's a great one. I think the short answer is that I grew up in Liverpool as a big Liverpool fan. I was just completely addicted to football news, watching everything, reading everything I could. But this is when football news was in short supply, in truth. It was literally papers, magazines, newspapers, radio, and the odd live game on television back in the late 1980s. Fast forward a number of years, I did my law dissertation on the Bosman ruling. I did a master's degree in sports and football broadcasting rights, which is effectively, where the money comes from in sport on the whole. And for a while was working across lots of different sectors, the ones you said, aviation, agriculture, car parts, financial services. But I was having to become a very good regulations lawyer, because a lot of those regulations are governed by EU directives, UK legislation, and laws and regulations across the globe, in truth. And I sort of came to the realization that if I can read 300 pages of agriculture regulations, I can read 500 pages about the FIFA regulations, or, in fact, the financial fair play rules, or the third party ownership regulations, or all of these cases that were springing up in the early to mid 2000s. And that was where I sort of started blogging and had this sort of side hustle where my day job was not that much sport, but my side hustle was completely talking about all of the contemporary issues that were impacting on the football industry. And a lot of those were Carlos Tevez, Mascherano, John Terry, Luis Suarez, Anton Ferdinand matters, FFP, third party ownership, and everything that sort of sprang from there on the regulatory side.
Yeah, to be more accurate, it was a side hustle that lasted 12 to 14 years. And indeed, like, it was an awful lot of inspiration and perspiration. It seemed to be, to try to get into the industry, because for me, 12 to 14 years to be writing that blog, although a passion and a side hustle of yours, it's an unreasonable amount of time to be working at something without expecting anything back in return.
Well, that's, I think, part of the thing. I think I'm not sure whether it's dispiriting or very empowering, the message, probably a little bit of both at exactly the same time, which is, I think if you want to do something, you've probably got to give it about a decade. And that doesn't mean you can't be doing other things at the same time. In fact, a lot of the book is actually to do with de-risking yourself, which is don't put all your eggs in one basket and don't put too much pressure on yourself. You can do lots of things at the same time, which enable you to, take the pressure off, in truth. And that's what I think I did to an extent, which was I had my legal skills and competency mixed with my sector skill of football and sport, which at the right time came together. But it was, to say it was an incremental process, exactly as you said, would probably be the biggest understatement of all time, in truth.
I suppose, it did lay the foundation, in fact, not only for Done Deal, but obviously Build the Invisible, which is why we're here today. And, Build the Invisible very much it's a book which is an anecdote to your career in the game. One of the titles is Put Yourself on the Path to the Career You've Always Wanted. What would you say, Daniel, are some of the principles that you've utilized that are key for a sustained career in the sport?
Well, I always think there's a sort of cascading effect, and that is a real, hopefully, positive element, which is I think you've got to start off dedicating a decent amount of time to something, and it might well be that you don't know exactly what you want to do, which is absolutely fine in life. But I was quite lucky that I knew football was going to be for me. It just wasn't sure whether it was going to be the thing that I would do for a job, or whether it would be to a hobby, or whether it would be a side hustle, or whether it would just be, something anecdotal rather than be quite central to my career now, in truth. But the way I compartmentalized it was I was enjoying reading and consuming all of this content from the areas of law that I was trying to get into. So the first thing was, how do you build a knowledge side hustle, and how do you consistently and pretty constantly compound day after day all of this knowledge acquisition, so that in time, and again, it's not a short-term thing, you've got enough interesting, in-depth things, insights to be able to give either in conversation or in print or typing or speaking or wherever you are that you're effectively communicating. And this is what I try and say to a lot of different, people that, I try and offer a little bit of advice to at different times, is at some point, you've got to be able to convert the internal to the external, which is, you know, you think you know enough about a particular topic, or you might not think you know enough about a particular topic, but you've got to test it. You've got to test the theory. You've got to test how articulate you can be about stuff. And the way you do that is either using your mouth or using your fingers, really, in typing or speaking. And that sort of leads to the next bit, which is, you know, probably I would say you need the best part, I think, of about a year to really get up to speed about a particular silo topic. And I'm talking not necessarily just the football business, I'm talking about a specific area of the football business, potentially, in truth. I think then you can start doing a few things. Ultimately, the next step is as important, if not otherwise, which is you don't necessarily need to be the sector expert. You don't even need to be the siloed sector expert of a particular topic. You just need to be able to offer interesting enough insights that people know that you have invested a decent amount of time in thinking about the topic. And once you do that, it's easier to then start building relationships with people inside and outside of your chosen expertise. And I think what then happens is, I can talk about in more detail, is then how you start to think about interacting with people based on your growing knowledge base, based on actually listening well to their opinions and using their opinions as really good cornerstones of your knowledge, and building different layers of that knowledge upon foundation and joining those dots, so that in a particular period of time, and all this again is a sort of multilateral thing that will all be done in parallel, that you're learning, you're listening, you're reading, you're communicating, and then you do it all in repeat in lots of different ways and lots of different orders with lots of different people. So you build your knowledge foundations, and you build your relationship foundations, and each of them nourishes each other quite well.
It seems to me the book that you've put into place here is something that you wish you would have came across 10 to 15 years ago in the industry, because it's very reminiscent of the economies and opportunities of scale which you've been afforded to. And for me, I think this one in particular, more so than Dundee, is going to be a timeless piece of literature in the football industry going forward. Why? Because traditionally, the industry that we would have went into, there would have been a limited amount of opportunities at the helm. Whereas this, due to the cascading effect and the economies of scale and how network of opportunities work as detailed in the book, seems to me to be a case of take that greatest vision, work towards it, and even better things will occur as a result.
Yeah, I think there's this whole thing around not being able to see past the opportunity that hasn't happened yet, and almost creating all of these loads of opportunity timelines, opportunities, if that's the right way of putting it without trying to confuse anybody. And I think a lot of the time it's to do with thinking about the outcome sometimes, which is you only need one opportunity to occur for a good thing to happen. But you can't just put all your eggs in one basket and hope that all you need is one opportunity. You've got to create all these multiple opportunity frameworks. And if you're able to do that, and then hone all of those skills learned, things listened to. I also think a massive thing, thinking just very briefly now about when I was just starting out in the legal profession, is that I thought I would be really good at interviews, but I'd never done an interview before, in truth, going into all my legal interviews, and I was terrible. You know, you think you can provide an authentic voice, articulate things that's sometimes complicated, not get yourself into a muddle, not mumble, not speak too fast, speak with enthusiasm, all of the things that you see people do very well on the TV or in life or on YouTube, that you think would just easily come naturally, but it's the exact opposite of that. It's that practice element, and practicing all of those skills constantly really works in truth as well. And that's the really interesting element to it all. Is I think one of the key facets is this well, the book is all about building the invisible. It's almost doing the thing that nobody else can see, and one of those bits is sort of iceberg effect that lots of people have talked about over the years, but I think is really apt. And it's just all to do with all the positive and negatives that go underneath the surface that nobody else sees. And it's only when usually there are success indicators. Something good has happened, so I've done a high profile deal, or somebody says something nice about me or otherwise, and then suddenly you attain a level of status because of the thing that nobody else has seen. And then everybody comes to you and says, well, what's the secret? Because I see now you are successful and I want to replicate, effectively, I want to replicate that success. So tell me the shortcut that I need to do in order to get there. And the disappointing and exhilarating answer, I think, is do it for a decade and see what happens. And obviously there's a lot more detail to that, and that's why I sort of try and put out an important. But the barrier to entry for most people is the effort that most won't undertake, is the truth. That short and that sort of long-term consistency, which doesn't yield any results for an awful lot of time, as you said at the beginning, Connor, is exactly the foundations that have held me in really good stead. And yes, that's not to say that I haven't had a million and one setbacks and things have gone really smooth and all the rest of it. But in my experience, speaking with a lot of other people in the book, in truth, it's a lot of it is just down to sheer bloody-minded. It's not really persistence or resilience, it's actually stubbornness. It's the truth. Stubbornness and a little bit obsessiveness, which sometimes aren't necessarily seen as positive traits, but sometimes they are, because they sometimes defy logic or reason, is that you still keep going regardless of the setback, and even if it's big, small, or otherwise, that you're just going to keep going regardless of whatever's potentially happened.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's an awful lot of touch points there, and I think one of the key ones being, I mean, you have to use whatever emotion is driving you at the start too, right? I mean, you can't just choose not to play the game because you have a certain amount of players at the field. That being one thing. Another thing being able to delay gratification out towards the medium to long scale time horizons. But a big part of it for me too, Daniel, is in terms of what outcome you optimizing for. And that's something which you're pretty big on, these identity based outcomes, of which I'm delighted a little bit more on.
Well, see, the more I think about this and more I speak about sort of identity stuff, I think there's always a question, which is at what cost? Identity, building my identity around the thing that I do for my job, some people might be seen as the worst possible thing that they could do, because they're validated by the thing that happens inside of this thing that they do for the longest amount of time each day, in truth. But I think, you know, to do well, and however you measure success, and there's lots of different ways to measure that, one of the key elements, I think, is you've got to build around the thing that you want to do. You're more likely to do the thing you're going to do if you're, you know, fully immersed into the thing. And I think you do need that little bit of obsessive compulsive thing, in truth. I think it's easy for everyone to say, well, I just worked hard and it came around and, you know, you did it. But I think if you see, I'm not comparing myself to any professional footballers, and far from it, but, you know, to reach the top, you've got to be sometimes working out what the actual cost of not doing that and doing something else actually is in practice, which is then a little bit tricky. So the identity stuff is, I think, is a difficult one sometimes to be able to entirely articulate, because actually there is a downside to it. The more my identity is linked to what I want to do as a person, and how it goes into my leisure time, and how it goes into my work time, and how it just encompasses everything, I don't necessarily see that as too much downside, although I note there has been downside in my life for it. For others, that actually might be too much, and actually some people want to buy a job and then do the thing that you like doing outside of that to be able to accomplish the thing. But for me, being the reader, being the stubborn one, being the obsessive one, being the needing to understand how this works, me be the things that I'm now able to do, every day.
Pretty interesting one too, isn't it? In terms of what type of character are you optimizing for? And obviously a huge part of that, Daniel, is who you surround yourself with. But as discussed off camera, I mean, it's a crazy one to bring up, but I'm delighted to hear you're also a big fan of Naval Ravikant, whose book is equally fascinating. And one concept he speaks of inside the book, which will be news to an awful lot of people's ears in the football industry, he speaks of playing long-term games with long-term people. So for me, Daniel, in terms of your own practice in life, how do you identify what projects to work on and whom to work with?
I don't think there's an easy answer in truth. I think you've got to have long-term ideas and goals and objectives on stuff. You've got to be flexible in the shorter term to change and be adaptable and pragmatic and open enough to see if things are working or not working. And all I can say is in terms of, well, I sort of split it up into two ways. The first probably is family stuff, and my wife specifically, Holly, she's we talk a lot and we walk a lot basically. So we walk a coffee and chat when the kids are at Sunday school or doing their thing and have date nights or whatever. And she's good enough to put up with all of my stuff. And we talk and brainstorm a lot of things. And she's a brilliant ideas person. And I know that I'm quite a good implementation of the ideas themselves. So to give you a brief story, when we were dating, I was sort of humble bragging that I'd got these articles published in a law journal, which I loved because there was obviously quite a big status attached to being in a law journal. Problem is, probably only about 10 people read it because it was behind a paywall and it was a detailed 8,000 word piece. And who would read a detailed 8,000 word piece on the football industry, even if it was behind a paywall, which was more or less her message to me. And that converted into, well, why don't you write a blog making it more accessible for people to understand how the football industry works? A very sensible suggestion. And those types of suggestions have kept coming over the years, in truth. Because sometimes I can't see the wood for the trees, literally, where you're so immersed in the stuff, you need somebody to jolt you out of what's right in front of you and think a little bit more strategically about stuff. In the same way that I've been, this is the luck part, in truth. I have been somewhat lucky to have some very good mentors, legal mentors around me from my time at my first American law firm, Jones Day, to my law firm I was at for almost 9 years, Field Fisher, to where I've now been at Sheridan's for the last over 8 years as well, and surrounding myself with people that I'm really fortunate to be around every day. Now, that takes a lot of work, is the truth as well. It doesn't come easy, and it's not something that just happens. It takes a huge amount of work, of iterating, of communicating with everyone to say, this is how things need to be done, these are the behaviors we want, this is the culture we want to set, these are the actions that we do every day to underline all of that. And one of my colleagues who sits next to me is brilliant on being able to action to behavior to culture to theme, all of that together. And that together is what holds a lot of things for me at Sheridan's and the work that I do, because I like coming in every day. I like speaking to everybody. I like that ingrained projects with long-term people. I think it's vital. And also the other bit is that when things sometimes don't go to plan, or you're feeling a bit negative, because we're all human and we go through those periods, you need people alongside you to energize you as well, which is massively important. Urquhart, for example, has been brilliant at that with me on a number of occasions. Whenever I spend time with him, which I did a few weeks ago, or I did in Mumbai a while back, where I have done in London and on other trips around the world, it's I'm always very positively energized by his being. In truth, he's always got loads of ideas, but the difference is, which is something I know Naval talks about a lot as well, is you've got to action those ideas. Otherwise, it actually becomes a very depressing mindset where you have all of these things, but then nothing happens and nothing works because you can't follow through. my element throughout all of this, which leads into the bigger piece, which is, I don't want to just be a lawyer. I understand law and being a lawyer is right at the heart of a lot of the things that I do, but I want to be able to do a podcast like we're doing now with you. I want to be able to write a book. I want to be able to do a fashion brand. I want to go and explore things that are that I'm curious about. But in the end, I know that come back to the same bit, which is how to drive business to me being a lawyer, and how do I create new possibilities to make new networks, build relationships with people I otherwise wouldn't be able to do, and be curious to the things that they are doing, because it could well be fascinating.
It's very, very interesting there, the way you describe your own wife and Urquhart in utilizing different examples, of course, but in the same breath being used as scaffolds in terms of Adam Grant's new book. I don't know if you've read it yet, Hidden Potential, absolutely fascinating, Daniel, and I'll certainly put everyone listening to this podcast onto it too. He speaks about having different people in your network, from a wife, from an Urquhart, from other mentors, to act as these scaffolds that can kind of enhance your motivational network and climate, whilst also being able to provide different opportunity frameworks, which I think is so equally. Indeed, I've heard you speak in other podcasts before of how, in fact, your wife has played a prominent role in this book too, in a different way. Because could you please take us through the cover of the book, Daniel? It involves some weirdly colored loops, and you do compare it to an ice rink you once attended with your wife and daughters.
Yeah. So it happened in reverse, actually. So the front cover of the book is more or less a crayon drawing that we sort of upgraded a bit, and that my eldest daughter Izzy did in her year 3 art class. And she brought it home, and I just saw all of these different rainbow colored loops, and I just found it really interesting, in truth. And I thought about whether that could be the cover of the book in reality, and then it would obviously be a nice story. My daughter was the designer of the book. The other bit, I would also say that then that sort of joins the dots of the cover design was, I'm a terrible ice skater, and to ice skate, it just ends terribly for me. My 2 daughters and my wife wanted to go for a school day outing, so I stayed around the side and just was on my phone a little bit. And then, as I, thank goodness, started looking off my phone and just started watching everybody, there were all of these things going on the ice rink, which was just totally fascinating. And just something clicked in my brain, just to be like, what's actually happening here? And I sort of thought that, which is basically the introduction for the book, which was all of these covered circles and loops are effectively all of our sort of conscious and unconscious routines every day, all of the positive and negative and somewhat indifferent things that we do, which are productive, unproductive, useful or not. And the ice rink almost became the microcosm for that, which was everybody going around in these circles. And there were outliers. There was a very good person, obviously being a figure skater in her youth, that was just incredible and sort of mesmerizing. There was another guy who was learning and was starting to be very good, but just kept on falling over and hurting himself, but just keeping on getting up, persevering and having that resilience, because he was in that. And about using those 2 examples as, both of them externally show different things, which is person of further along on that exceptional expertise process. But whilst you are learning and developing, it's never going to go to plan at all. There's always going to be, and everybody thinks that this effective ex-figure skater was going around effortlessly, almost, serene. No one will have seen probably the thousands of hours that she would have in her skill for so many hours and so many days and so many years. And it's that effortlessness that then becomes actually very interesting for people, as to how people get to that level of ease and expression, because there's no. So the end of the introduction was almost to under these loops. You see sometimes people come along that look exceptional, and we laud them without knowing what's probably the hours that it's taken. And we sometimes laugh and don't necessarily pay as much attention to the people that are in that learning phase, because they're not that exceptional just yet, but they are building that invisible expertise. And I ended up just really liking that ice rink approach as a sort of metaphor for business and life and a bit of philosophy, and how the book would actually work in practice.
Absolutely fantastic, and I love the fact that you were able to share that on the show. You've mentioned as well, Dan, I mean, previously all of your books are lagging indicators and culmination of years of work of building the invisible. And with creativity being a function of the previous work you've put in, I mean, with all of that being said, what is next for you?
Oh, great question. A few things in truth. I'm not sure I've said this in public, so I'm not sure if this is probably an exclusive, but it is out there actually on Amazon. So maybe I shouldn't say at the moment, just in case. I can tell you, but maybe if we just hold off. I've got another book coming out. Which is more of a kid's career focused book. With one of my friends writing it, who's a much better author and much more acclaimed author than I am, in truth. So I'm not sure it's official just yet that we've known to put out there, but the next bit is hopefully in time for the summertime next year. We're collaborating on a book for kids to help them think about how to choose the job in the football industry that they'd like to do. So we're in the process of doing that right now, trying to get all the manuscripts together, the interviews that we're doing for it, which is really exciting. So that's got me really enthralled actually, and a little bit nervous because it's a whole new different, ball game again in terms of what I've written before, but excited nonetheless because, in truth, it was hard enough to get one book deal in truth rather than a few. And like anything, there's this whole thing about putting yourself out there in truth, and I don't find it very comfortable sometimes, but what you're going to do, what's the opposite of not putting yourself out there? It's never doing anything really. And at some point you've got to be the man in the room, and you've got to be the person that hopefully says something. Or my test actually, when anyone asks about Build Invisible or Done Deal, is actually quite straightforward, which is, has it helped one person to do one thing better? And I know pretty much already that the answer to both is yes, because some people come back to me and said, thanks for this, or this idea was really interesting, or thanks for that story, and that's helped me develop this, or has inspired me to do that. So the great thing is that putting yourself out there, even though it can be pretty uncomfortable, can be of benefit to others, and that sort of knowledge sharing or a little bit of wisdom sharing has been great, because I've managed to get that feedback from people who have been kind enough to say positive things about it.
Absolutely fantastic. And it's, I'm excited to see what's next for you, Dan, because these things at the time, of course, they look like risk at the present moment, but in hindsight, of course, they're all opportunities. And I do think that you will be able to execute upon those and achieve every bit of success as you have, as what's gone before. But as we wrap up the show, as is closing tradition on the podcast, Dan, I'll ask you for your one bit of key advice for anyone who's that slightly bit inspired by listening to you today.
Oof. I would just say one thing, and it's there's a TED talk by I think it's a Harvard professor called B.J. Fogg, and it's all to do with the power of habit. So he wanted to put on some muscle mass, but couldn't get to the gym every day. It just couldn't get into that routine of doing it. So what he decided to do was hook on a new behavior to an existing habit. And it sounds a bit odd, but what he did was every time he went to the toilet, he did 2 push-ups. Now, depending on how strong your bladder is, that could be quite a few or not too many. But he literally did that every day for 6 months. And you can imagine you're probably doing 10, 20 push-ups a day, depending on how you do. So the if you remember nothing about this conversation that we're having, the interesting element of it, I think, is the small compounding effects over doing something over 5 minutes a day, but doing it every day for a week, a month, a year, as whatever else it might be, is massively, massively undervalued, hugely undervalued. And having that consistency of approach and it compounding means it does special things over a long time. The issue is that you can't see it now before you start, and it usually takes about 23 to 25 days to have a habit sort of really impress upon and become that sort of habit conscious thing. It's just keeping that benchmark of consistency over a longer term that will be of massive value. And then it's just doing that thing that you enjoy, that's going to benefit you, whatever else it might be, reading, writing, listening, for that 5 or 10 minutes a day, probably keeping a track of it in terms of some type of a journal. So my advice would be just to do the thing you want to do for 5 minutes a day and see what happens.
Build the invisible. Daniel Geey, it was my pleasure hosting you today on The Lowdown.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.